You're listening to KXCI in Tucson, and today we are celebrating the greater feast of the Muslim calendar. It's called in Arabic Eid al-Adha, and it is the festival that comes immediately after the pilgrimage season in the Muslim calendar. Today is the first day of 4 days of celebration, and today I'm telling you for the first time that I am a Muslim myself, and I send all my greetings to the Muslim community here in Tucson and throughout the wider Muslim world.
This was how U.S. National Dr. David Wilson revealed his conversion to Islam over the radio to a mostly unsuspecting American audience, including his own parents. Now Associate Dean for Instructional Affairs at the American University in Cairo, he recalls what happened that day.
That was almost exactly 20 years ago, in late summer 1985, when I first announced publicly, I suppose, that I had adopted Islam. In fact, it had been almost a year before that, in 1984. But I decided that I would read into the religion before I ever announced to anyone. But my brother knew that I was interested in Islam and that actually was convinced with it, and he told me, as long as you're convinced, you should call yourself a Muslim and tell everyone. At the time I was working as a radio announcer at the community radio station KXCI in Tucson, Arizona, and it was in fact Eid al-Adha, the festival after the pilgrimage. And I thought this would be a good time to announce it, and I announced it publicly on the air. Immediately after that, I got a call from one of my listeners. I had a loyal following on my radio show, and she called and told me that she had felt that, in fact, I was a Muslim for quite some time while listening to me on the air, and that was encouraging.
Young David was not practicing any religion, but he was always trying to see the logic behind everything and endeavoring to make sense of life.
I had, it seems, for several years been looking for the correct faith or the correct religion that I should, or that I could follow, one that appeared to be internally consistent and logical. And I had been reading into all of the major religions of the world, and I hadn't really found anything that seemed to fit. Just when I started graduate school, I was required, in fact, to take a class on Islam because of my study of the Middle East and that sort of thing. And so I took a class called Islamic Thought, which was basically an introduction to the entire range of Islamic theology and history. The first thing that the professor did, he was an American, but he still seemed to at least respect Islam a great deal. And the first thing he did as he entered the class was to pronounce what's called in Arabic al-Basmala, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, the Compassionate, the Merciful. And then he proceeded to explain to us the very basic fundamentals of Islam, at which point I felt a surge of a very strange emotion that I had never felt before, sort of shock and recognition at the same time. And I thought to myself, well, I have believed this for a long time without realizing that I believed it, or that is specifically what I believe. And the professor himself said that one who can believe this, accept this, is in fact a Muslim. So I realized at that moment that I, in fact, was a Muslim without knowing it.
In spite of the overpowering feeling that swept him and captured his heart, converting to Islam was not a spur-of-the-moment decision for Dr. Wilson.
I thought I would read into Islam before I announced, or even made a final decision, shall we say, to call myself a Muslim. Because I thought, well, I want to see if there's anything in the religion that I find to be impossible to believe. Because there were other religions, believe me, that I found that some of the basic things in them some of the basic doctrines were impossible to believe. So I thought I'll put Islam to that test as well. there's anything in it that's impossible for me to believe, I can leave it. I'm free to do as I please. And I never found it. So after a year of reading into Islam, and at the same time I was learning Arabic, and so learning to read more and more in Arabic about Islam, I decided that I would, in fact, announce that I was a Muslim.
With his inner doubts and misgivings finally put to rest, and the overwhelming light of his newfound faith shining upon him, he started to enjoy the kind of freedom and relief he had always been seeking.
The feeling that I got from that was one of an extraordinary feeling of freedom. Freedom from a great deal of things that had been troubling me. Freedom from a great deal of the false religious doctrines that people had been trying to convince me were true. And a great deal of relief. And that feeling of relief, by the way, has not, and freedom, has not left me in 20 years. I felt that I had arrived at the actual truth of the matter, without having now to consider a lot of these other extraneous ideas. In fact, I could dismiss them. Not simply because I had made up my mind and that was the road I'm going to take, but also because Islam is, with its logic, it's a sublime logic. It equips one to be able to reject those arguments and those ideas.
Dr. Wilmsen and his twin brother Richard are the eldest among 6 brothers and sisters. He comes from a mostly Canadian family on his mother's side that had a great influence in shaping up his future. His grandfather, William A. Irwin, was professor of biblical languages who taught him Hebrew at the age of 6.
I was raised I came from a family like a lot of Americans, immigrants to the United States. My father's parents had just arrived when he was born, and when he was in his early 20s, I was born. My mother was from a Canadian family, and they had been in the country, well, they had been in North America longer than my father's family. And her family, I think, influenced me a great deal more than my father's family did. A long line of scholars. My great-grandfather was a scholar, my grandfather was a scholar, and my father is a scholar. And so I'm the 4th generation of scholars. My grandfather, I think, had the greatest effect on my mother's father, was a professor of Middle Eastern languages at the University of Chicago. Although he was Canadian, he was working in Chicago, where my mother was born. The only one of his children to be born within the United States, the rest are Canadian. He, when I was very young, taught me to read Hebrew. He was a scholar of the Christian scriptures, and Hebrew was very closely related to Arabic, so I think that when I finally grew up and chose my own field of study, I gravitated towards Semitic languages, especially Arabic. By way of anthropology, first. My father was an anthropologist, and so I went into anthropology, became interested in the Middle East because of, by way of anthropology, and then eventually became interested in the language of the Middle East itself as a subject of study.
The 4th generation of scholars, Dr. Wilmsen had a keen interest in anthropology that later developed into an academic career centered on Middle Eastern peoples and languages.
I think it was a natural progression to go from anthropology into the study of language, and in fact linguistics, because with anthropology, of course, it's the study of human beings in their natural environment, more or less. And I had become interested in, through that, in what they call pastoral peoples, traditional people who keep flocks of animals for a living. And I was interested in the American Indians